Railway time: how trains forced the world onto one clock. For most of human history, time was a local affair. The hour was something you read off the sky, not off a network. When the sun stood at its highest point over your town, it was noon, and that moment arrived a little earlier in the east and a little later in the west, because the earth turns and the sun does not wait for committees. A town 30 miles to your west would reach its own noon a couple of minutes after yours. Nobody minded. Nobody could even have measured it reliably, and more importantly, nobody needed to. If the market opened when the church bell rang, and the church bell rang when the sexton judged it was time, then the fact that the next valley was running 3 minutes behind was of no consequence to anyone alive. This is one of those facts that sounds almost unbelievable to a modern ear, that as recently as the early 19th century, two English towns an hour's ride apart could legitimately disagree about what time it was, and both be correct. Oxford ran about 5 minutes behind London. Bristol ran roughly 10 minutes behind. Penzance, out at the far end of Cornwall, lagged London by some 20 minutes. These were not errors. They were honest readings of the local sun, and each town's clock was a faithful little instrument of its own particular longitude. What changed everything was not philosophy, or science, or any grand decision about the nature of time. What changed everything was the railway timetable. Consider the problem from the point of view of a railway company in the 1840s. You are running trains between London and Bristol. Your trains are fast, astonishingly fast by the standards of the age, faster than a galloping horse, faster than anything most of your passengers have ever experienced. And you must publish a timetable, because a railway without a timetable is just a very expensive way of leaving when you feel like it. But which time do you print? If you say the train departs Bristol at noon, do you mean Bristol's noon or London's noon? Because those are 10 minutes apart, and 10 minutes, on a railway, is the difference between catching your connection and standing on a cold platform watching its tail lights recede. The danger was not merely inconvenience. It was collision. On a single-track line where trains pass at agreed points, a discrepancy between one station's clock and the next is not a nuisance, it is a recipe for two locomotives occupying the same stretch of rail at the same instant. The railways needed every clock along the line to agree, not approximately, but exactly. And so the railway companies did something that no king, no parliament, no church had ever managed to do. They imposed a single, uniform time across hundreds of miles of countryside. The Great Western Railway led the way, adopting London time across its whole network in 1840. Other companies followed through the 1840s. They called it railway time, and at first it existed only inside the railway's own world, on the station clocks, in the timetables, in the pocket watches of the guards and the signalmen. The man who made this practical was, more than anyone, the Astronomer Royal at the Royal Observatory in Greenwich, because Greenwich was where the authoritative time was kept, and Greenwich was where it could be sent out from. From 1852, the observatory began transmitting a time signal down the new electric telegraph wires, the same wires that ran alongside the railway tracks. A pulse of electricity, carrying the exact moment of Greenwich noon, could now travel the length of the country in a fraction of a second. For the first time in history, a town in Cornwall and a town in Scotland could know the same instant, together, as it happened. This is the quiet hinge of the whole story, and it is worth pausing on. The telegraph and the railway arrived together, twins of the same industrial moment, and they needed each other. The railway needed the telegraph to keep its clocks in step and its trains from colliding. The telegraph found one of its first killer applications in distributing time. And the consequence, almost as a side effect, was that the abstract idea of a single national now became, for the first time, a physical reality that ordinary people brushed up against every day. Because here is where it gets genuinely strange. As the railways spread railway time across the country, the towns themselves were left with two times. There was the old local time, read from the sun, still kept by the parish church and the town hall. And there was the new railway time, brought in along the tracks, kept by the station clock. For a while, the two coexisted in an uneasy and slightly comic fashion. Some town clocks were fitted with 2-minute hands, one for local time and one for railway time, so that a citizen could glance up and see both the time the sun said it was and the time the train said it was. In Bristol, the famous Corn Exchange clock still carries 2-minute hands to this day, a black one and a red one, a permanent monument to the years when a city could not quite decide which clock to believe. Not everyone surrendered gracefully. There is a celebrated legal echo of the confusion, a court case in 1858 where a man lost an appeal because the court had opened at 10 o'clock local time, and he had arrived at 10 o'clock by the clock he was using, and the question of which 10 o'clock was the real one became, briefly, a matter of law. The judge ruled that 10 o'clock meant local mean time, not railway time, a small victory for the sun over the timetable, and one of the last. The tide was running the other way, and everybody could feel it. The formal surrender came slowly. Through the 1850s and 1860s, more and more public clocks were quietly switched over to Greenwich time, town by town, until the old local times survived only as curiosities. It was not until 1880 that Parliament finally caught up with what the railways had already accomplished, passing the Statutes, Definition of Time, Act, which made Greenwich Mean Time the single legal time for the whole of Great Britain. The law did not create standard time. The law merely ratified, decades late, a fact that the railway companies and the telegraph had established on their own, for entirely practical reasons, without asking anyone's permission. And then the idea went global, by exactly the same logic, at exactly the same kind of meeting. In 1883, the railways of North America, facing a continent-sized version of the same problem, with dozens of competing local times making a nonsense of cross-country schedules, agreed among themselves to divide the continent into time zones. Not the government. The railways, again, acting in their own interest. The following year, in 1884, the International Meridian Conference met in Washington and chose Greenwich as the prime meridian of the world, the 0 point from which all longitude, and therefore all time zones, would be measured. The reason Greenwich won that vote, over Paris and several other contenders, was not national vanity. It was that the overwhelming majority of the world's shipping already used charts based on Greenwich, and the world's railways and telegraphs were already, in practice, running on a system that radiated out from that one observatory on a hill above the Thames. So the next time you cross a time zone, flying, or driving, or simply noticing that a colleague in another country is starting their day as you end yours, it is worth remembering where the lines on that map came from. They were not handed down by astronomers contemplating the heavens, or decreed by emperors carving up the globe. They were drawn by railway companies trying to print a timetable that would not get their passengers killed. The whole architecture of global time, the zones, the standard hours, the very idea that now is the same agreed instant for millions of strangers at once swings on that small, unglamorous, intensely practical hinge, a train that needed to know, to the minute, when it was due. It is worth sitting for a moment with. What was quietly lost in the exchange, because it was not nothing. Before railway time, every town kept a clock that was, in a small but real sense, its own, tuned to its own sky, its own meridian, its own particular relationship with the sun overhead. To standardize time was to sever that connection, to replace 1,000 local noons with one borrowed noon piped in along a wire from a hill in southeast London. Most people barely noticed, and those who did mostly welcomed the convenience. But something genuinely old came to an end, the idea that the time belonged to the place you were standing in, rather than to a network you happened to be plugged into. We gained the train that ran on time, and we gave up, without much ceremony, the sky as a clock. The sun, which had told the time for every human being who ever lived before the 1840s, was quietly retired from the job within a single generation. Not because it was wrong, but because it was inconveniently local. And we have lived on railway time ever since, every one of us, whether we have ever boarded a train or not.